This is the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, Khorasan edition, video 2. In video 1, we covered the introduction by Laurence Housman, which contains pages basically 7 through 14, and Edward Fitzgerald by G.F. Maine, which runs from pages 15 to 36. In this video, we will be reading Omar Khayyam by Edward Fitzgerald, and perhaps, if there is time, the first edition of the Rubaiyat, circa 1859, by Edward Fitzgerald and Omar Khayyam. Now, we begin. Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam was born at Naishapur in Khorasan in the latter half of our 11th century, and died within the first quarter of our 12th century. The slender story of his life is curiously twined, perhaps they should mean intertwined, again the phrasing is rather dated, about that of two other very considerable figures in their time and country, one of whom tells the story of all three. This was Nizam-ul-Mulk, Vizier to Alp Arslan the son, and Malik Shah the grandson of Togrul Beg the Tartar, who had wrested Persia from the feeble successor of Mahmud the Great, and founded the Seljukian dynasty, which finally roused Europe into the Crusades. This Nizam-ul-Mulk, in his Wasiyat, or Testament, which he wrote and left as a memorial for future statesmen, relates the following, as quoted in the Calcutta Review, number 59, from Mir Khan's History of the Assassins. Pardon me. We have a quote below. One of the greatest of the wise men of Khorasan was the Imam Mawafaq of Naishapur, a man highly honored and reverenced. May God rejoice his soul. His illustrious years exceeded 85, and it was the universal belief that every boy who read the Quran or studied the traditions in his presence would assuredly attain to honor and happiness. For this cause did my father send me from Toots to Naishapur with Abdus Samad, the doctor of law, that I might employ myself in study and learning under the guidance of that illustrious teacher. Towards me he ever turned an eye of favor and kindness, and as his pupil I felt for him extreme affection and devotion, so that I passed 4 long years in his service. When I first came there, I found 2 other pupils of mine own age, newly arrived, Hakim Omar Khayyam and the ill-fated Ben Sabah. Both were endowed with sharpness of wit and the highest natural powers, and we 3 formed a close friendship together. When the Imam rose from his lectures, they used to join me, and we repeated to each other the lessons we had heard. Now, Omar was a native of Naishapur, while Hassan ben Sabah's father was one Ali, a man of austere life and practice, but heretical in his creed and doctrine. One day, Hassan said to me and to Khayyam, quote, "It is a universal belief that the pupils of the Imam Mawafaq will attain to fortune. Now, even if we all do not attain thereto, without doubt one of us will. What then shall be our mutual pledge and bond?" And we answered, "Be it what you please." "Well," he said, "let us make a vow that to whomever this fortune falls, we shall share it equally with the rest, and reserve no preeminence for himself." "Be it so," we both replied, and on those terms we mutually pledged our words. Years rolled on, and I went from Khorasan to Transoxiana, and wandered to Ghazni and Kabul. And when I returned, I was invested with office, and rose to be administrator of affairs during the Sultanate of Sultan Alp Arslan. He goes on to state that years passed by, and both his old school friends found him out, and came and claimed a share in his good fortune, according to the school day vow. The vizier was generous and kept his word. Hassan demanded a place in the government, which the Sultan granted at the vizier's request. But discontented with a gradual rise, he plunged into the maze of political intrigue of an Oriental court, and, failing in a base attempt to supplant his benefactor, he was disgraced and fell. After many mishaps and wanderings, Hassan became the head of the Persian sect of the Ismailians, a party of fanatics who had long murmured in obscurity, but rose to an evil eminence under the guidance of his strong and evil will. In A.D. Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, 1090, he seized the castle of Alamut in the province of Rudbar, which lies in the mountainous tract south of the Caspian Sea, and it was from this mountain home he obtained that evil celebrity among the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountains, and spread terror through the Mohammedan world. And it is yet disputed whether the word assassin, which they have left in the language of modern Europe as their dark memorial, is derived from the hashish, or opiate of hemp leaves, in brackets, the Indian bahang, in bracket, with which they maddened themselves to the sullen pitch of oriental desperation, or from the name of the founder of the dynasty, whom we have seen in his quiet collegiate days at Naishapur. One of the countless victims of the assassin's dagger was Nizam-ul-Mulk himself, that old schoolboy friend. We have an editor's note here. Some of Omar's Rubaiyat warn us of the dangers of greatness, the instability of fortune, and, while advocating charity to all men, recommending us to be too intimate with none. Attar makes Nizam-ul-Mulk use the very words of his friend Omar, in brackets, Rubaiyat XXVIII. My apologies that I don't know how to read Roman numerals at present. When Nizam-ul-Mulk was in the agony, in brackets, of death, he said, "O God, I am passing away in the hand of the wind." Continuing, Omar Khayyam also came to the vizier to claim his share, but not to ask for title or office. "The greatest boon you can confer on me," he said, "is to let me live in a corner under the shadow of your fortune, to spread wide the advantages of science, and pray for your long life and prosperity." The vizier tells us that when he found Omar was really sincere in his refusal, he pressed him no further, but granted him a yearly pension of 1,200 mithqals of gold from the treasury of Naishapur. Evidently, mithqals was the unit of currency used in the region at that time. At Naishapur thus lived and died Omar Khayyam, busied, adds the vizier, in winning knowledge of every kind, and especially in astronomy, wherein he attained to a very high preeminence. Under the Sultanate of Malik Shah, he came to Merv, and obtained great praise for his proficiency in science, and the Sultan showered favors upon him. When Malik Shah determined to reform the calendar, Omar was one of the 8 learned men employed to do it. The result was the Jalali era, in brackets, so called from Jalal-ud-Din, one of the king's names, end bracket. A computation of time, says Gibbon, which surpasses the Julian and approaches the accuracy of the Gregorian style. He is also the author of some astronomical tables entitled Z.G. Malik Shahi. Z.G. Malik Shahi. And the French have lately republished and translated an Arabic treatise on algebra. His Takhalas, or poetical name, in brackets Khayyam, signifies a tent maker, and he is said to have at one time exercised that trade, perhaps before Nizam-ul-Mulk's generosity raised him to the state of independence, that is to say, financial independence. Many Persian poets similarly derive their names from their occupations. Thus we have Attar, a druggist, or I suppose, druggist. So basically a pharmacy person who runs a pharmacy, I suppose, would be the modern equivalent. Asar, an oil presser, etc. Additional editor's note here. Though all of these, like our Smiths, Archers, Millers, Fletchers, etc., may simply retain the surname of an hereditary calling. That makes sense. So if somebody says your name is John Smith, Smith is a type of actual line of work. At one time, somebody was a blacksmith, they made stuff out of metal. And if somebody says your name's Dan Archer, well, an archer is, again, a line of work. It's a calling. A miller's, you work in a mill grinding grain. Fletcher's, you put fletching on arrows, etc. Makes perfect sense. Omar himself alludes to his name in the following whimsical lines. Khayyam, who stitched the tents of science, has fallen in grief's furnace and been suddenly burned. The shears of fate have cut the tent ropes of his life, and the broker of hope has sold him for nothing. We have only one more anecdote to give of his life, and that relates to the close. It is told in the anonymous preface, which is sometimes prefixed in his poems. It has been printed in the Persian in the appendix to Hyde's Veterum Persarum Religio, p. 499, so that's page 499. And de Herbelat alludes to it in his Bibliothèque under Khayyam. We have another editor's note here. Philosophe musulman qui a vécu en odeur de santé, my French is abysmal, but my apologies. Odeur de santé dans sa religion vers la fin du premier et la commencement du second siècle. Okay, that no part of which, except the philosophy, can apply to our Khayyam. Okay, again, my lack of foreign language skills are really coming into play here. I do need to improve in that regard. Terribly sorry about that. Hopefully you're able to read it below. Anyway, continuing. Where were we here? Ah, yes, here we are. It is written in the chronicles of the ancients that this king of the wise, Omar Khayyam, died at Naishapur in the year of the Hegira 517. So that would be 517 in the Persian calendar, or Anno Domini in the year of our Lord 1123 in the current modern calendar used internationally the world over in this year 2017. Continuing. In science, it's 2018. What am I saying? The time of this recording is July 11th, 2018. My 21st birthday, incidentally. Anyway, continuing. In science, he was unrivaled. The very paragon of his age. Khwaja Nizami of Samarkand, who was one of his pupils, relates the following story. I often used to hold conversations with my teacher, Omar Khayyam, in a garden, and one day he said to me, My tomb shall be in a spot where the north wind may scatter roses over it. I wondered at the words he spoke, but I knew that if he were to die, but I knew that his were no idle words. We have another editor's note at the base of this page. The rashness of the words, according to de Herbold, consisted in being so opposed to those in the Koran. No man knows where he shall die. This story of Omar reminds me of another. Oh, okay, that is interesting. The editor's note is continued on the next page. I suppose they ran out of space. But it is definitely from the same editor's note because they leave no other markings to denote it as not being a continuation, and it's also cut off mid-sentence on that one page. Allow me to reread that sentence and the rest of the citation. End note. This story of Omar reminds me of another so naturally, and when one remembers how wide of his humble mark the noble sailor aimed, so pathetically told by Captain Cook, and there's a little thing here, not by Dr. Hawkesworth, in his second voyage, I.374, when leaving Ulietia? I don't know where that place is, and I'm butchering the name. Orio's last request was for me to return. When he saw he could not obtain that promise, he asked the name of my Maria, in brackets burying place. As strange a question as this was, I hesitated not a moment to tell him, Stepney, the parish in which I live when in London. I was made to repeat it several times over till they could pronounce it. And then Stepney, not Stephanie. Stepney Maria no toot. And then there's another little hook off of that. Oh, it's not a 9, that's a hook. Was echoed through 100 mouths since. I afterwards found the same question had been put to Mr. Foster by a man on shore. He gave a different and indeed more proper answer by saying, no man who used the sea could say where he should be buried. Now, continuing on with the upper portion of this page, as the citation and editor's note had continued across the page in a rather unorthodox format. Years after, when I chanced to revisit Naishapur, I went to his final resting place, and lo! It was just outside a garden, and trees laden with fruit stretched their boughs over the garden wall, and dropped their flowers upon his tomb, so that the stone was hidden under them. Thus far, without fear of trespass from the Calcutta Review, the writer of it, on reading in India this story of Omar's grave, was reminded, he says, of Cicero's account of finding Archimedes' tomb at Syracuse, buried in grass and weeds. I think Thorwaldsen desired to have roses grow over him, a wish religiously fulfilled for him to the present day, I believe. However, to return to the subject of Omar. Though the Sultan showered favors upon him, Omar's Epicurean audacity of thought and speech caused him to be regarded askance in his own time and country. He is said to have been especially hated and dreaded by the Sufis, whose practice he ridiculed, and whose faith amounted to little more than his own when stripped of the mysticism and formal recognition of Islamism under which Omar would not hide. Their poets, including Hafiz, who are, in brackets, with the exception of Ferdowsi, in bracket, the most considerable in Persia, borrowed largely indeed of Omar's material, but turning it to mystical use more convenient to themselves and the people they addressed. A people quite as quick of doubt as of belief, as keen of body sense as of intellectual, and delighting in a cloudy composition of both, in which they could float luxuriously between heaven and earth, and this world and the next, on the wings of a poetical expression that might serve indifferently for either. Omar was too honest of heart as well as of head for this. Having failed, however mistakenly, of finding any providence but destiny, and any world but this, he set about making the most of it, preferring rather to soothe the soul through the senses into acquiescence with things as he saw them, than to perplex it with vain disquietude after what they might be. It has been seen, however, that his worldly ambition was not exorbitant, and he very likely takes a humorous or perverse pleasure in exalting the gratification of sense above that of intellect, in which we must have taken great delight, although it failed to answer the questions in which he, in common with all men, was most vitally interested. For whatever reason, however, Omar, as before said, has never been popular in his own country, and therefore has been but scantily transmitted abroad. The MSS of his poems, MSS is, I do believe, an abbreviation of something, though offhand I couldn't say what that is. Continuing, though. The MSS of his poems, mutilated beyond average casualties of Oriental transcription, are so rare in the East as scarce to have reached westward at all, in spite of all the acquisitions of arms and science. There is no copy at the India House, none at the Bibliothèque. I do believe they mean bibliothèque, but it's spelled very strangely. Bibliothèque would be library in French. Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. Or perhaps I'm misremembering how it would be spelt in French. Again, my foreign language skills do have some room to grow. Yeah, Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris. That's what that should say. We know but of one in England, number 140 of the Useley MSS at the Bodleian, written in Shiraz, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, 1460. This contains but 158 Rubaiyat, one in the Asiatic Society's library at Calcutta, in brackets, of which we have a copy, closing bracket, which contains, thus far incomplete, 516 516, though swelled to that by all kinds of repetition and corruption of the original. So von Hammer speaks of his copy as containing approximately 200, while Dr. Sprenger catalogues the Lucknow MS at double that number. Another editor's note here. Since this paper was written, adds the reviewer in a note, we have met with a copy of a very rare edition printed at Calcutta in 1836. This contains 438 tetrastiches, with an appendix containing 54 others not found in some MSS. So here we go. The scribes, too, of the Oxford and Calcutta MSS seem to do their work under a sort of protest, each beginning with a tetrastiche, in brackets, whether genuine or not, closing bracket, taken out of its alphabetical order. The Oxford with one of apology, the Calcutta with one of expostulation. Supposed, says a notice prefixed to the MS, to have arisen from a dream, in which Omar's mother asked about his future fate. It may be rendered thus. And here we are, another quotation of a poem by Omar. O thou who burn'st in heaven, for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long be crying, mercy of them, God? Why, who art thou to teach, and he to learn? The Bodleian quatrain pleads pantheism by way of justification. If I myself, upon a looser creed, have loosely strung the jewel of good deed, let this one thing for atonement plead, that one for two I never did misread. The reviewer, to whom I owe the particulars of Omar's life, concluded his review by comparing him with Lucretius, both as to natural temper and genius, and as acted upon by the circumstances in which he lived. Now, the reviewer is noted here below as being a Mr. Professor Cowell. Anyway, continuing. Both indeed were men of subtle, strong, and cultivated intellect, fine imagination, and hearts passioned for truth and justice, who justly revolted from their country's false religion and false or foolish devotion to it, but who fell short of replacing what they subverted by such better hope as others, with no better revelation to guide them, had yet made a law to themselves. Lucretius, indeed, was such material as Epicurus furnished, satisfied himself with the theory of a vast machine fortuitously constructed, and acting by a law that implied no legislator, and so composing himself into a stoical rather than Epicurean severity of attitude, sat down to contemplate the mechanical drama of the universe, which he was part actor in, himself and all about him, in brackets, as in his own sublime description of the Roman theatre, end quote, in bracket, discolored with the lurid reflex of the curtain suspended between the spectator and the sun. Omar, more desperate or more careless of any complicated system as resulted in nothing but hopeless necessity, flung his own genius and learning, with a bitter or humorous jest, into the general ruin which their insufficient glimpses only served to reveal, and, pretending sensual pleasure as the serious purpose of life, only diverted himself with speculative problems of deity, destiny, matter and spirit, good and evil, and other such questions, easier to start than to run down, and the pursuit of which becomes a very wary sport at last. With regard to the present translation, the original Rubaiyat, in brackets, as missing an Arabic guttural, these tetrastiches are more musically called, closing bracket, are independent stanzas, consisting each of 4 lines of equal, though varied, prosody, sometimes all rhyming, but more often still, as here imitated, the 3rd line a blank, somewhat as in the Greek Alcaic, where the penultimate line seems to shift and suspend the wave that falls over in the last. As usual with such kind of oriental verse, the Rubaiyat follows one another according to alphabetic rhyme, a strange succession of grave and gay. Those here selected are strung into something of an eclogue, with perhaps a less than equal proportion of the, quote, drink and make merry, end quote, which, genuinely or not, reoccurs over frequently in the original. Either way, the result is sad enough, saddest perhaps when most ostentatiously merry, more apt to move sorrow than anger towards the old tent-maker, who, after vainly endeavoring to unshackle his steps from destiny, and to catch some authentic glimpse of tomorrow, fell back upon today, which has outlasted so many tomorrows. As the only ground he had got to stand upon, however, momentarily slipped from beneath his feet. Now, we have an introduction to the 3rd edition, the notation of the editions, and the various editions themselves, beginning with the introduction to the 3rd edition. While the 2nd edition of this version of Omar was preparing, Monsieur Nicolas, French consul at Recht, published a very careful and very good edition of the text from a lithograph copy at Tehran, comprising 464 Rubaiyat, with translation and notes of his own. Monsieur Nicolas, whose edition has reminded me of several things and instructed me in others, does not consider Omar to be the material Epicurean that I have literally taken him for, but a mystic, shadowing the deity under the figure of wine-bearer. There's an and sand with a C. I'm not entirely certain as to the way of interpreting that, unfortunately. As Hafiz is supposed to do, in short, a Sufi poet like Hafiz and the rest. I cannot see reason to alter my opinion, formed as it was more than a dozen years ago, in brackets 1868, closing bracket, when Omar was first shown me by one to whom I am indebted for all I know of Oriental and very much of other literature. He admired Omar's genius so much that he would gladly have adopted any such interpretation of his meaning as Monsieur Nicolas if he could. We have another editor's note here. Perhaps would have edited the poems himself some years ago. He may now as little approve of my version on one side as of Monsieur Nicolas's theory on the other. Anyway, continuing. That he could not appears by his paper in the Calcutta Review, already so largely quoted, in which he argues from the poems themselves, as well as from what records remain of the poet's life. And if more were needed to disapprove Monsieur Nicolas's theory, there is the biographical notice which he himself has drawn up in direct contradiction to the interpretation of the poems given in his notes. See pp. XIII-XIV of his preface. Again, I really need to learn how to read in Roman numerals better. Indeed, I hardly knew poor Omar was so far gone till his apologist informed me. For here we see that whatever were the wine that Hafiz drank and sang, the veritable juice of the grape it was which Omar used, not only when carousing with his friends, but, so says Monsieur Nicolas, in order to excite himself to that pitch of devotion which others reached by cries and hurlements. And yet, whenever wine-bearer, okay, again, there's an and sand and a C, which I assume means and so on, or etc. But again, that's not common parlance in writing in the present day. I can interpolate what that means, but I can't prove it. Anyway, basically, and C occur in the text, which is often enough. Monsieur Nicolas carefully annotates Dieu, la divinité, and C, and so on, carefully, indeed. That one is so carefully indeed that one is tempted to think that he was indoctrinated by the Sufi with whom he read the poems. Note to Rubaiyat II, page 2. I realize II is going to be 2 in Roman numerals, so that's Rubaiyat 2, page 8. A Persian would naturally wish to vindicate a distinguished countryman, and a Sufi to enroll him in his own sect, which already comprises all the chief poets of Persia. What historical authority has Monsieur Nicolas to show that Omar gave himself up, in brackets, avec passion à l'étude de la philosophie des Sufis? Again, my French is rather horrible. Anyway, preface P XIII. I think that might be 53. Again, my understanding of Roman numerals somewhat limited. The doctrines of pantheism, materialism, necessity, and so on were not particular to the Sufi, nor to the Lucretus before him, nor to Epicurus before him. Probably the very original irreligion of the thinking men from the first, and very likely to be the spontaneous growth of a philosopher living in his age of social and political barbarism under shadow of one of the 72 religions supposed to divide the world. Von Hammer, or if it's a German name, Faunhammer, according to Sprenger's Oriental Catalogue, speaks of Omar as a free thinker and a great opponent of Sufism, perhaps because, while holding much of their doctrine, he would not pretend to any inconsistent severity of morals. Sir W. Useley has written a note to something of the same effect on the flyleaf of the Bodleian MS. Oh, MS is going to be manuscript. Ah, okay, that's what that is. Yeah, so MS is going to be shorthand for manuscript when used in this text. Now I understand. That completely flew over my head at the time, initially, when I looked at that. All right, continuing. Bodleian manuscript. And in two Rubaiyat of Monsieur Nicholas's own edition, Sufi and Suf are both despairingly named. No doubt, many of these quatrains seem unaccountable unless mystically interpreted, but many more as unaccountable unless literally. Were the wine spiritual, for instance, how wash the body with it when dead? Why make cups of the dead clay to be filled with la divinite by some succeeding mystic? Monsieur Nicolas himself is puzzled by some bizarres and trope orientals, allusions and images, in brackets, d'un sensualites quelque fos revoltante. It's revolting to the senses. I think that's what that means. Anyway, indeed, which les covenances do not permit him to translate. I think that means that his sensibilities do not permit him to translate it, but still which the reader cannot but refer to la divinite. Okay, editor's note. A note to quatrain 234 admits that, however clear the mystical meaning of such images must be to Europeans, they are not quoted without, in brackets, rougissant, again, another French word, even by laymen in Persia. Now here's another French quotation. Quant aux termes de tendre qui comment se quatrain comme tant de autres dans ces récits nos lecteurs habitués maintenant allégrante des expressions si souvent employés par Khayyam pour rendre ses pensées sur le monde divin et à la singularité de ces images trop orientales d'une sensualité quelquefois révoltante, n'aimoront pas de peine à se persuader qu'il s'agit de la divinité, bien que cette conviction soit vivement discutée par les mullahs. That's what that says. The mullahs, musulmans, et même par beaucoup de laquais qui rougissent véritablement d'une pareille licence de leurs compatriotes de l'égard des choses spirituales. Okay. Let me see if I could try and infer what that says, but it's probably best to continue. I've butchered the French language enough. Terribly sorry to any francophones listening. All right, continue. No doubt, after many of the quatrains in the Tehran, as in the Calcutta copies, are spurious, such rubaiyat being the common form of epigram in Persia. But this, at best, tells as much one way as another. Nay, the Sufi, who may be considered the scholar and man of letters in Persia, would be far more likely than the careless epicure to interpolate what favors his own view of the poet. I observe that very few of the more mystical quatrains are in the Baudelaire manuscript, which must be one of the oldest, as dated at Shiraz, AH 865, that's the Persian calendar, the year 865, and in the contemporary calendar used in the world today, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, 1460. And this, I think, especially distinguishes Omar, in brackets, I cannot help calling him by his, no, not Christian, familiar name, from all other Persian poets, that, whereas with them the poet is lost in his song, the man is allegory and abstraction. We seem to have the man, the bonhomme, Omar himself, with all his humors and passions, as frankly before us as if we were really at a table with him, after the wine had gone round. I must say that I, for one, never wholly believed in the mysticism of Hafiz. It does not appear there was any danger in holding and singing Sufi pantheism, so long as the poet made his salam to Mohammed at the beginning and end of his song. Under such conditions, Jalaluddin Jami Attar and others sang, using wine and beauty indeed as images to illustrate, not as a mask to hide, the divinity they were celebrating. Perhaps some allegory, less liable to mistake or abuse, had been better among so inflammable a people. Much more so when, as some think with Hafiz and Omar, the abstract is not only likened to, but identified with, the sensual image. Hazardous, if not to the devotee himself, yet to his weaker brethren, and worse for the profane in proportion as the devotion of the initiated grew warmer. And all for what? To be tantalized with images of sensual enjoyment, which must be renounced if one would approximate a god who, according to the doctrine, is sensual matter as well as spirit, and into whose universe one expects unconsciously to merge after death, without hope of any posthumous beatitude in another world to compensate for all one's self-denial in this. Lucretius' blind divinity certainly merited, and probably got, as much self-sacrifice as this of the Sufi, and the burden of Omar's song, if not "let us eat," is assuredly "let us drink, for tomorrow we die." And if Hafiz meant quite otherwise by a similar language, he surely miscalculated when he devoted himself and his life and genius to so equivocal a psalmody as this, for his day to this has been said and sung by any rather than spiritual worshippers. However, as there is some traditional presumption, and certainly the opinion of some learned men, in favor of Omar's being a Sufi, and even something of a saint, those who please may so interpret his wine and cupbearer. On the other hand, as there is far more historical certainty of his being a philosopher of scientific insight and ability far beyond that of the age and country he lived in, of such moderately worldly ambition as becomes a philosopher, and such moderate wants as rarely satisfy a debauchee, other readers may be content to believe with me that, while the wine Omar celebrates is simply the juice of the grape, he bragged more than he drank of it, in very defiance, perhaps, of that spiritual wine which left its votaries sunk in hypocrisy or disgust. Written by Edward Fitzgerald. Now, we have a brief page here, as mentioned, breaking down the various editions found in this text, And given the length of this video, I shall finish at the end of that, and the following video in this playlist shall contain the first edition of the Rubaiyat. Now, the Fitzgerald editions. First edition, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the astronomer poet of Persia, translated into English verse, London, Barnard Quaritch, Castle Street, Leicester Square, 1859. On the verso, G. Norman Printer, Maiden Lane, Covent Garden, London. Small quarto, brown paper wrappers, 75 quatrains, 22 notes. Second edition, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the astronomer poet of Persia, rendered into English verse. Second edition, London, Barnard Quaritch, Piccadilly, 1868, in brackets, John Child and Sons, printers. Quarto, paper wrappers, 110 quatrains, 25 notes. Third edition, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the astronomer poet of Persia, rendered into English verse. Third edition, London, Barnard Quaritch, Piccadilly, 1872. Quarto, half Roxburgh, maroon cloth, 101 quatrains. Fourth edition, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and the Salman and Absal of Jami, rendered into English verse. Barnard Quaritch, 15 Piccadilly, London, 1879. F. Cap, 4-2, half Roxburgh, 101 quatrains. Fifth edition, Letters and Literary Remains of Edward Fitzgerald, edited by William Aldous Wright, in 3 volumes. London, Macmillan and Co., and New York, 1889. All rights reserved. Crown, 8, VO, text in Volume 3, 101 quatrains. At the base of this page, we have another printer's mark, I suppose you could say, listing that this page is okay for use in the publication. And with this, I leave you for this edition. Please stay with us for the following video in this playlist, in which we shall be covering the first edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. We shall naturally be completing the entirety of this text, so we hope you stay with us, and we hope you enjoy it. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.